Almost a year ago, I published a video titled Why I'm Not Excited for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, which stands tall as the most disliked video in my channel's history. I released the video shortly after the first reveal of Dawntrail during FanFest because I was simply unimpressed by what the developers presented about the then upcoming expansion. I was told by all of you that it's too soon, we haven't seen enough to judge it, and even you need therapy. Well, after months of anticipation, Dawntrail arrived, and after playing it for about a week, I have so many thoughts that I just had to distill them into a video because I think I was right to be skeptical all those months ago. Now, I want to make a couple of things clear. I'm not completely done with the main story quest of Dawntrail. At the time of this recording, I'm in the 5th area of the game following a massive narrative twist and an inciting incident that will surely propel the final act of Dawntrail towards a satisfying conclusion, I hope. I still plan on making a video reviewing Dawntrail once I'm done, so look forward to that in the future. Also, I'm aware that spoilers are a consideration. I have no intention of ruining Dawntrail's narrative for anyone who hasn't made it as far as I have. While I might have to reference particular events or show footage from the game's many cutscenes, I promise to keep my references vague. If you're concerned about seeing something that you haven't seen yet, then I recommend listening to the video instead. With all of that said, it's time to parse out the truth. Is Dawntrail another massive win for Creative Studio 3, or is it a massive disappointment? Let's find out. But first, let's thank today's sponsor. It's War Thunder. I'm just kidding, it's me. Writing, recording, editing, and producing my own background music, it's a lot of work, so here's the pitch. All videos 2 days early and ad-free for $1 a month on Patreon. Alright, let's get to work. It's hard to gauge whether or not Dawntrail is a success or a failure. According to Yoshi P himself, the expansion has seen the most concurrent players in the game since the release of A Realm Reborn. However, it also has the lowest Metacritic score of any of the game's expansions by a wide margin. A Realm Reborn and Heavensward only managed to reach 86, while Dawntrail is currently at a 76. More importantly, the user score is lower, currently a 6.5, with many users citing boredom and others complaining about her. We will discuss Wuklamad, of course, and I certainly have a lot to say about Dawntrail's darling protagonist, but not before we discuss the boredom that seems to have inflicted many 14 players, myself included. When Dawntrail was unveiled by Creative Studio 3, I was struck by a particular thought that no one else seemed to share. Isn't this the same thing that we've already done during the previous expansions? Obviously, it isn't literally the same, but the structure of the expansion and the experience of leveling through it absolutely is. Before we had any details about Dawntrail, I was able to confidently make the following predictions. The expansion would have 6 zones, each of which would house 10 ether currents to be found in the world, with 5 more to be gained via quests. There would be fates, of course, but none of them would be difficult, and the enemies that we would encounter in those areas would pose no threat. This has turned out to be true. There would be a dungeon at every odd level, and it would comprise 2 hallways with 2 groups of enemies in each, then a boss repeated thrice. This has turned out to be true. The story would be mostly read, sometimes watched, and almost never played. This has turned out to be true. I said this almost a year ago, and I say it now with total vindication. You have already played Dawntrail. I often think about the conditions under which Final Fantasy XIV was remade. We all know the deep lore of the disastrous launch of 1.0 and the miracle that Yoshi P and his team conjured in order to relaunch the game with A Realm Reborn. Just like all of your favorite React streamers, I too watched the NoClip documentary, just not for the purpose of re-uploading someone else's work, but one specific comment during that documentary from Yoshi P stuck out to me, and I haven't been able to let it go since. He talked about micromanaging his developers' work down to the minute in order to minimize risk. At the time, both the game and the company were in dire straits, so I imagine that the environment at Creative Studio 3 is different today, but I have to wonder if that aversion towards risk hasn't persisted over a decade later. How else would you explain this recycled template that molds every 14 expansion? I say this having played and loved all of the expansions preceding Dawntrail, so what changed? Isn't it a bit unfair to levy this criticism now while excusing it for years? Here's the answer. Anyone here who's up to date with 14's story understands that we've concluded the Hydaelyn and Zodiark saga, which brought to a close 10 years of fantastic storytelling. While I can't speak for everyone, it was the strength of that narrative which motivated me to read hundreds of thousands of lines of dialogue and to watch dozens of hours of cutscenes despite the game's lack of, well, gameplay. This always ignites the anger of the masses when I say it, but I will die on this hill. 14 is closer to a visual novel than it is a role-playing game, but I can forgive that when the story is good. What is 14 then, when it isn't being driven by exceptional storytelling? The answer is Dawntrail, and it kind of sucks. In order to prepare for my comprehensive review of the expansion, I've been collecting as much footage of my journey as possible, and I discovered that I often recorded 20, 40, even 60 minutes of footage during which I never touched a hotkey. There is no other way to say it. This is boring. Dawntrail was an opportunity for Creative Studio 3 to usher in a new age for Final Fantasy XIV. This expansion was the time to take risks, to upend dated philosophies, to experiment with the mundane, to redefine what it means to play Final Fantasy XIV. For all of the studio's talk about entering a new 10-year era, the truth is that the game hasn't experienced a metamorphosis. Rather, Dawntrail is a testament swearing fealty to the status quo, and it declares what this upcoming decade will look like, which is exactly like the last one. I promised that we discuss Wuklamot, so let's do it. After that last chapter of the video, I imagine that you're expecting me to recite a series of unkind things about Dawntrail's protagonist, but the truth is that I love Wuklamot. She's Luffy, for God's sake, and I really love One Piece. She came off a bit strong at the end of Endwalker, I'll concede to that, but it's difficult not to love her. She's earnest, she's heroic, she's a little bit of a dumbass, but I think that as a character, she brings a lot of joy, sweetness, and laughter to the world of Final Fantasy XIV. I am a big fan of Wuklamot. However, I'm not a fan of the English vocal performance for Wuklamot. Dawntrail was never going to be about us. Anyone who's surprised that the Warrior of Light and the Scions of the Seventh Dawn have taken a back seat to the claimants for the right of succession hasn't been paying attention. It isn't a problem on principle that the spotlight is on a newcomer to 14's story. The problem is that it was critical to hire the right person for the job, and I say this with all due respect, truly. Senna Breyer, who voices Wuklamot, was not the right person. Not since Minfilia in A Realm Reborn have I been so distracted by a vocal performance that it affected my enjoyment of the game. The player spends nearly every moment of his or her journey through Dawntrail with Wuklamot, so it becomes grating to listen to her speak. It isn't offensive or unbearable, but the performance does stand beneath every other performance on the cast. For an example of the opposite, I'll point to Luis Bermudez, who voices Kona, the second promise. His performance is of such an absurd quality that it overshadows even those of the seasoned veterans on the cast. Kona steals every scene that he's in. Bermudez is a master of pacing, of utilizing silence, of subtle expression. It is delightful to listen to his work, and I look forward to hearing Kona speak every time he's on screen. In all of my years with Final Fantasy XIV, I have never changed the game's language because I was always satisfied with the performances of the game's English cast. Dawntrail changed that. Wuklamot specifically changed that. Halfway through the second zone, I switched the game's language to Japanese, sacrificing the familiar voices that I've grown to love from the Scions of the Seventh Dawn in order to make Wuklamot's performance more enjoyable. It's worth noting that the Japanese actress Ayaka Shimoyamada plays the role beautifully. While I do believe that Breyer's performance was lacking throughout the expansion, it's important to note that the blame should be laid at the feet of the vocal director tasked with capturing these performances. There are other instances in Dawntrail which see the game's voiceover quality regress into a similar state as A Realm Reborn. Without spoiling too much, the fourth zone in Dawntrail introduces, for the first time I think, American Southern accents, and they f***ing suck. Speaking of bad expansions, I was struck by the many similarities between Dawntrail and A Realm Reborn. There is the obvious metaphysical role that both versions of the game play. Each is meant to be a foundation of a grander decade-long journey. They also share something of a similar plot. The expansion's first two acts revolve around the rite of succession and the journey to acquire these keystones, which reminded me of the crystals of light that the player is meant to collect during his or her journey through A Realm Reborn. Of course, the biggest similarity between the two expansions is that they're both painfully slow. While I can respect 14's commitment to world building and storytelling, which necessitates painstaking presentations for the player, I cannot abide the pacing on display in Dawntrail, particularly during the opening act. The game feels like a monotone drone, occasionally interrupted by a few undertuned dungeons, duties, and trials. In truth, the story's real inciting incident doesn't occur until the ending of the fourth area of the game, which makes most of the activities that you participated in prior feel inconsequential. I have over 11 hours of footage captured of my experience with Dawntrail, which is only a fraction of the total runtime of the expansion so far. Having committed well over 20 hours to the game, most of which was reading and walking and reading again, it is unbelievable that it took as long as it did for the narrative to finally pique my interest. Whether or not the final two areas of Dawntrail will stick the landing and improve my opinion of this expansion is yet to be seen, but you can be sure that I'll make a video when the time comes. As the title suggests, I am disappointed in Dawntrail. I hoped against hope that Creative Studio 3 would understand that the absence of a strong narrative would create a vacuum in the 14 experience that would need to be filled with something else. Perhaps a new approach to quest design, exploration, dungeon infrastructure, anything. For the expansion to have been built within the confines of the template that defined all of its predecessors is, I think, a wasted opportunity during what is a critical juncture in the life of this MMORPG. I want to say for the record that there are a lot of things about Dawntrail that I've loved, but I want to save those details for the larger comprehensive review that I'm currently working on. In the interest of brevity and of capturing my first impressions within a week of the game's launch, I've decided to omit those opinions. It's also worth stating that in spite of Dawntrail's narrative failures or its structural issues, the functions of the game, which I've interacted with repeatedly in previous expansions, are present and completely intact. I will grind the expansion's fates in order to increase my ranking in the zones, fighting off sleep in the process. I'll fish and gather and craft as usual. I'll run the extreme trials and jump into Savage with my long-running static, and if I decide that I'm bored of whatever Dawntrail has to offer, then I can go back and continue chasing Necromancer or grinding in Eureka and Baja. While I hoped that 14 would reinvent itself in this new era, if the status quo is what we can expect for the next 10 years, then fine. Once the credits roll and the game actually lets you play, 14 is pretty good. I just know that if Creative Studio 3 was less risk-averse, then this could have been much, much better. But now that all of my thoughts are off my chest, that concludes my first impressions of Dawntrail during its first week of release. This will likely be another massively disliked video, but that's okay. I don't take it personally, so feel free to express your anger at me in the comments. Don't be shy about using that dislike button if you think my opinions were way off base. One way or another, there's plenty of Dawntrail content coming your way, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell before you go. Please look forward to a comprehensive review of the expansion with plenty of guides and essay videos following soon after. Minding my manners, of course. Thanks for watching.